Welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us online and here at the ASU California Center at the historic Herald Examiner Building. With great respect, Zócalo Public Square acknowledges the Huaviatam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Yangna that we now know as downtown Los Angeles. We honor their elders, past and present, and the Huaviatam descendants who are part of the Gabrieleño Tongva and the Fernandeño Tataviam nations. We recognize that the Tongva are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. As Ku'uyam, we recognize our responsibility and obligation to care for their land. I'm Erin Brown, and I'm the editorial director of Zócalo Public Square, an Arizona State University media enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. You can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org, on podcast platforms, and on YouTube, so please subscribe for our latest programs. Tonight, we are excited to partner with KCRW to present Do We Even Need a City Council? I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Janaea Williams. Janaea is KCRW's host of All Things Considered. She has worn many hats in public radio, as a reporter covering arts and culture for WNYC, as a tech reporter at WWNO in New Orleans, as a live events producer, and as a newscast anchor. And she has won national awards for her work. Over to you, Janaea.
All right. All right. Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you for joining us online. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, I'm Janaea Williams. I'm the host of All Things Considered on KCRW, and I'm so happy to be here again to host another Zócalo event and to talk about the issues and the future of the LA City Council with our wonderful panel, although it has a much spicier title online. Do we even need a city council? I'm so sorry, Nithya. So typically we start by kind of setting the table and talking a little bit about ourselves, but I think that there's nothing really typical about what's going on in LA politics right now and in the city council. So I think we should just start with councilmember Nithya Raman first. First, let me introduce my panel. Let's see. Leonora Camner is Director of Public Access Democracy, which is a Democratic lottery advocacy organization. And she's on the steering committee of the Represent California Project, a call for a state constitutional assembly. She's also executive director of Abundant Housing LA, which is a housing advocacy organization. In 2019, she led the effort for the Southern California Coastal Plan, and she served on the Santa Monica Housing Commission from 2019 to 2022. She's also been an attorney working in the nonprofit sector to defend tenants from eviction. Welcome, Leonora. Thank you so much.
You.
Karthick Ramakrishnan is a professor of public policy at UC Riverside, and he's the executive director of California 100, which is a statewide initiative focused on building a shared vision and strategy for California's next century that is innovative, sustainable, and equitable. He also founded the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside and AAPI Data, which is a national publisher of demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. He's written many articles and 7 books, most recently Citizenship Reimagined and Framing Immigrants. And he's currently working on projects related to racial equity in philanthropy and regional development. Hi, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Nithya Raman is an urban planner, a graduate of Harvard and MIT, a working mother, an immigrant, and a member of the LA City Council representing District 4. After several years serving on the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council, she co-founded the Sila Neighborhood Homeless Coalition. She ran for city council in 2019 and became the first Asian American woman and the first South Asian ever to serve on the city council. She's currently chair of the Information Technology and General Services Committee, vice chair of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee and of the Housing Committee, and a member of the Economic Development and Jobs and Immigrant Affairs, Civil Rights and Equity Committees.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nithya, for coming.
And now, because of the incidents that led to this panel, I am now acting chair
Acting
of
chair.
Housing Committee and Homelessness and Poverty.
Both?
Yes. And last but not least, Miguel A. Santana is the president and CEO of the Weingart Foundation since 2021. He has over 30 years of leadership experience in fiscal, legislative, political, and community issues. He was previously the city administrative officer for the city of LA, where he oversaw the city's $9 billion budget and designed the city's first ever comprehensive homeless strategy. He's also served as one of 5 deputy chief executive officers for LA County, overseeing social service programs, supporting people experiencing homelessness. He engages in numerous civic efforts to create a more equitable Southern California, including serving as chair of the Committee for Greater LA. Miguel, thank you so much for being here. So, as I was saying, I think we should just get it out of the way, the elephant in the room, or the 2 elephants in the room, the 2 slightly racist elephants who will not stand down and will not resign. So I just want to start with you, Councilmember Raman, and ask, how are you feeling about all this that's transpired in the last almost 2 months?
Well, you know, I think this has been an incredibly shocking moment for the city of Los Angeles, and as someone who sat beside these individuals around the horseshoe where we legislate on these issues, I was appalled at the remarks that I heard, embarrassed for the body that I serve on, and sad for Los Angeles, because those words really, in my mind, don't represent me or anyone else who lives in the city. I don't think they represent the approach that I see among Angelinos around me. But I also, you know, I think we are at a moment right now where the longer that these individuals stay on the council, particularly one who, you know, one has already been voted out, and a new person will be taking his seat shortly. But I think the longer that people refuse to resign, I think there's opportunity for more pain and for more division to form in this city. And I think one thing that I'm very, very focused on in this moment is to really think about what unites us as a city, to think about the fact that what was happening in that room was not about, as they were saying, Latino power, but really about their own power, because they were making statements about candidates who were Latino running against either them or other challengers on the council. It was really about consolidating personal power. And I think the more that we focus on that, and the more that we talk about how we can change processes in the city so that we don't have a repeat of that kind of divisive conversation again, I think that to me is the way forward out of this moment, to use this pain to really fix some of the big issues that we're facing here in LA.
And before we dive into talking about some of the processes and ways we can change things, is there anything that you want people to know? Because you're on the ground, you're doing the work of being a city council member. Is there anything that you think that people are getting wrong, or anything you want people to know about the work that you do?
Well, you know, I'm pretty new to politics here in Los Angeles. I ran for office not having been involved in, you know, local Democratic clubs. I went into the building in December of 2020 when I started, not really knowing anyone in the building. And I think the thing that drew me to run for office was this real feeling that we can do better here in Los Angeles. That, you know, in my own neighborhood where I saw more tents appearing on the streets, where I saw people losing their homes, that I knew as an urban planner, as someone who'd studied the city and watched the city, that the city could be more muscular in addressing those challenges and taking them on, and in having tough conversation with residents, because none of these problems are going to be easy to solve. And I think the thing that I want to tell people as I go out, and I see that this incident has destroyed trust and credibility even further here in the city of Los Angeles. The thing that I want to tell people as I go out and talk to them is that not every council member is like that, and that the city doesn't have to be a place where you don't have faith. I think we can build a better city. We can work together to build it and to reimagine it. And there are many of us who are there, whether it be staff, whether it be elected officials, and people throughout this city that I see when I'm out meeting people who want to have faith and who want to have trust, and that I'm really here to do the work with them to try and rebuild that.
Great. So let's talk about how we got here. Miguel, I mean, Can you help me understand how we got here? I know LA has a history of interfaith coalitions, interracial coalitions, and I'm sure it still does, and they're very robust, and it still will continue to have those very important coalitions. But can you help me understand how we got here to this point?
So if you sort of look at what was going on in that room, as the councilwoman stated, it was really about the distribution of power and the hoarding of power. And that's an LA tradition. It wasn't unique. It's happened generation after generation. In many ways, the city was founded on those principles. You know, the evolution of the maturity of Los Angeles was occurring at the same time that redlining was the law of the land. In the 1920s, the super majority of the city was not permissible for people of color to buy property in. And it wasn't an accident, it was very intentional. And so our governance structure mirrored that. Our commission structure mirrored that. Our policing policy mirrored that. It was all about maintaining privilege for some at the expense of others. And so when you take a step back and sort of really try to ignore the language and the vulgarness of what was heard, the real conversation was about power. And so it's not an accident that we got here. When you sort of look at it from a historical perspective, and it's very likely to happen again unless we change it. And so I think what has been inspiring for me is, number one, I think there's a real reckoning of that reality, of that legacy. And it's honest and it's raw and it's very clear. And at the same time, the coalition that you referenced is very strong, because it is very powerful to see all of Los Angeles react the way Los Angeles has. To see the public testimony, 20% of it being done in Spanish. To see folks saying, this is not the Los Angeles that I know, that I love, that I want us to be. And demanding that we do something dramatically different. And so the challenge for us, for this generation of Angelenos, is to figure out, well, what is it that we're going to do differently? And not waste this moment to simply let the headlines go away and let the temperature die down, but really present a new vision for the future of Los Angeles and its very systems that govern us.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, about the vision that we're all here trying to achieve. I mean, before we start talking about how we can change things, Leonora and Karthick, what do you think, what are we going for? What are the goals? Like, what does a real representative democracy look like?
Well, I can't say how much I agree with Miguel's comments. Because of the history of these kinds of problems, as Miguel said, there's a long history of power hoarding. And so, we need to face the fact that there's a systemic problem with the way that governance is happening. And it's not just a matter of electing better people or just hoping the next person is going to have better morals. The problem is that power is corrupting. It's corrupting even for people who have the best intentions, who have great visions. And honestly, a lot of people don't even have good intentions to begin with. So we're going to hand over power to these people. And I think it's no surprise when you think about the way that people get power. They have to raise a lot of money for campaigns. They have to spend a lot of time doing that. They also need to have the special connections and the insider connections that help get endorsements. And that's not accessible to most people. The word democracy is really about regular people being in power. But when those are the requirements to get into office, that's out of reach for most people. So, so the problem is the people in power don't have real representation of people who are struggling with many jobs, who are rent burdened, who are busy, with childcare. So some people say, oh, that's just democracy. That's how it works. But it really doesn't have to be that way. There's other forms of democracy that have been around since ancient times that we still use in a lot of ways today. In places like Belgium and Paris, they have permanent parts of government that use another system called democratic lotteries. And we actually use them in a lot of ways here in LA. Most people know about it through the justice system, where we have juries. Those are a democratic lottery system. And if you think about it, if you were in a criminal trial and your fate was on the line, you would never want that decision to be made by a political process with campaigns and lobbyists. You want it to be guided by the facts and experts and hear all viewpoints and sides through deliberation and a decision. That's the democratic lottery. And
I want to talk more later about democratic lotteries and what they are and how they would look, what it looks like. But I want to ask Karthick, what does it look like to you? What would it look like to have a better governance, a better system of governance?
Yeah, thank you.
What does it look like?
Well, first, so with something like California 100, right? We think about 100 as 100 years, but also 100 as what does it mean to be to keep it 100, or to be 100% to be 100% functional, right? To have a system that fully works. And one of the ways that we talk about California is how can we make sure, and it's not just at a statewide level, but at a regional and local and community level too, to be a state of innovation and a state of inclusion. At least recently we're known for both of those things. We have a terrible long history of being very exclusionary, but in the last 20, 25 years or so, California is really kind of repairing itself and trying to reach those higher ideals. But when it comes to innovation, right, not just in Silicon Valley or in LA, so many different parts of California, we have innovators everywhere. But ironically, not when it comes to our systems of governance. We actually tend to be quite conservative. If we think of some of the major innovations that happened, it was about a century ago with direct democracy that we're still living with. But we haven't really proliferated deliberative democracy, which is, in some ways, could repair some of the problems with direct democracy. So I think what it looks like is, as Miguel said, to use this opportunity to open up a much larger conversation. Yes, we can make little tweaks here and there, right? And we can think about some things like campaign finance reform. That would be more than a tweak. So Oakland is now voting on what they call democracy dollars. It's something that started in Seattle to make everyone a political donor, not just people with resources.
Money.
So those are things that would be potential game changers on certain types of dynamics. But I would argue, similar to Leonora, it's now is the time to open up all the possibilities and to really talk through the pros and cons, and then to figure out what kind of new systems do we need to create. Much as the progressive movement a century ago, was bold and pushed through a bunch of reforms, first at the local level, that then radiated up to the state level.
So democratic lotteries, how would they work? What would it look like in Los Angeles?
So one of the beautiful things about democratic lotteries is that they're very customizable to different situations. And so one example of democratic lotteries that I think is really important in this conversation, this moment right now in LA, is that we actually have a situation where the redistricting commission is a democratic lottery system. And that's being, that's in conflict with the interests of certain members that were involved in the scandal with the LA City Council. So, but to answer your question, how it would work, generally they work just like juries, where they're a representative cross-section of the community. So they have the diversity and the breadth of experience of the community, and and they hear from experts. So I think one misunderstanding is the idea that democratic lotteries will take away expertise from the process. But actually they elevate expertise more because they're able to impartially listen to expertise without having other concerns, like they don't have to worry about getting reelected. The decisions can be guided just by those facts that they hear from the experts and the other information that they get. But I think, in this moment, certainly I would never say like we should get rid of LA City Council and make it a Democratic lottery overnight. But I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities for us, like Karthick was saying, to do more experimentation and to try out more innovative forms of government that really get to the heart of this problem. And one opportunity is if there is a charter reform commission. I think that would be a great opportunity to get Angelenos empowered to really sit in the seats of a very important decision-making process in the city, about what the charter is going to be, and we could do that through a Democratic lottery.
And then Karthick, you've studied other places where they do other things that work, that are more effective. So can you talk more about that?
Sure. Democratic lotteries, like Leonora mentioned, there's just different things. By the way, even when it comes to urban planning, there are things that cities do right now through charrettes and other methods to really get citizen input, and I mean that in maybe the original sense of that term of a member of the city, right? So it's not just citizenship, thinking about it at a national level and legal immigrant status. There's an interesting innovation. There are some local governments in Japan and a few other places that have done these intergenerational commissions, but they're like simulations. And what they do is to take the room, take half the people and make them members of that city in the year 2050, and then the other half representing the present moment. And then they have to come together and make decisions that will serve both parties. Now that is amazing because it scrambles all sorts of things, because you have to role play, right? Including role play the interests of future generations, people not yet even born that are going to inherit the city. Mm-hmm. And what are you doing, right, to have that long-term view? Participatory budgeting, there are several jurisdictions that in California that do it in kind of certain controlled settings, but we could do a lot more. And then online town halls. Some of these are, there are some cities across the world that are dabbling in it more and more, but we're still far away from people letting those type of innovations be dominant. But there are things happening elsewhere that we could learn from.
And Nithya, do you hear anything that you think could work for us, or something that we're already doing? I know participatory budgeting, a lot of places in LA are already doing that.
Yes, and actually I did want to correct one thing. We don't have a system like what you were talking about for the redistricting commission that we have for the city of Los Angeles or for LAUSD, which is governed by the same charter. Part of the challenge with the redistricting process is that commissioners are appointed by the council themselves and can be replaced at will, can be relatives, can be, they can be lobbyists, which some of them were, with business in front of the city. They had really significant conflicts of interest. They had some people who were in the LAUSD commission ended up being spouses with someone who ended up running for the seats that they themselves helped design. None of that is banned by the current charter. And so I think there's a lot we need to be doing. The kind of redistricting commission that you're talking about, I think, exists at the state level in California, but not in the city of LA. But I think there's a lot that we can do, like even thinking about what are innovations that are happening in independent redistricting, that we don't have to rebuild, build a new machine here. We can actually just learn from existing innovations that have happened at the state level, that have happened at the county level, that have happened across America, and really start putting in some of these more democratic elements into really important processes here. And I think that there's a lot that you both have said that's really exciting and that's potentially workable. I think the question is really just if there is an idea that we can consolidate around, and how would you actually, make it happen once people can consolidate around it. I know in my own work, I'm trying to say, okay, how can we get some of these minimum innovations that we need in order for the city to function more effectively? Things like putting in a truly independent redistricting commission at the city. Things like expanding the size of the council so that question of representation can be more, one that's had by many more people who are elected here for the city of Los Angeles. Things like taking certain kinds of decision making out of the hands of particular council members so that we don't have opportunities for corruption over land use decision making, for example. So I think there's lots of there's a lot of opportunities that we can have for fixing our current system, and I think that things that both of you are talking about are incredibly exciting. But I think we have to figure out a way to rally around a particular model that can really elevate what we're doing here in LA.
How about neighborhood councils? I know that some people even suggested putting neighborhood council members on the city council for vacant seats. How do you think that can work, or do you think that can be a model if they were empowered to do things on a larger scale?
So that word you mentioned in terms of empower, I think we need to start digging deeper into that. Because I think, yes, I think there's all sorts of different innovations we can consider, but ultimately, and Miguel, I think you talked about some of the stuff that may be deep-rooted is, these are fights in terms of power over access to resources, over land use decisions, and power, existing power holders do not give up that power easily. But this is where I think sometimes innovation can help if it creates some uncertainty, where people who are, have existing power don't feel like they are certain to lose in the new system, right? And to maybe adapt to those systems. But absolutely, I think, well, on the other hand, you could think about maybe a strong mayor system, for certain types of accountability that might escape when you have expand the city council, then accountability in terms of your representative, that function can be increased. But if you don't have someone who's responsible for the whole city that actually has any meaningful power or influence to actually change things, that could actually lead to greater frustration. So I think we need to, Charter Revision Commission, or just this larger notion of what is the kind of political system we want, what are the kind of things we want to optimize for, encourage, what are the kind of harms we want to minimize, but really try to see some of this with fresh eyes, even if the solutions are old solutions, but at least approach it with that kind of civic energy, I think, is critical.
I don't disagree that this is a time to look at governance, but I think it's also a time to look at the role of government and the expectations that Angelenos have of their city. And I think at the core of some of this conflict is real failure that regular Angelenos feel about the role of the city in being responsive to the issues that they most care about. Whether it's just keeping the streets clean, whether it's responding to the crisis of homelessness with urgency, whether it's the relationship between the police and residents. Some very fundamental questions and challenges are being asked. And so I think it's important that in the context of talking about governance, we can't lose sight of asking the question, for what purpose? What is the shared outcome we want to get to? Success isn't just changing the boxes around or creating different processes. That's not what success should look like. Success should be something you could actually see in the community, the real outcomes that people feel, that it actually reflects the kind of community that we all want to have. And I think the frustration that many Angelenos have is not just about the question of power. Most people don't even think about that. They think about, why does it take so long for graffiti to be removed from my block, or why is that couch always being dumped on the same corner every day? And I think those issues have to be part of the outcome to what a successful governance structure looks like.
I think it was the former city council member, Michael Wu, who said you cannot regulate decency. You cannot, it's difficult to kind of put that in place, and people who govern, maybe this job attracts people who are not the most decent. And so I'm wondering if any of these—
Present company excluded.
Present company excluded. I'm wondering if any of the solutions we're talking about today respond to that problem. Like, aside from representation, the idea that it's difficult to regulate decency.
Well, we should assume that the folks in office aren't decent. We shouldn't structure a system with that expectation. And that's why at the end of the day, all of the proposals being offered is about diluting power from those in power in deciding what the distribution of power should be. So it's really should be designed under the worst case scenario in mind. So that you're not hoping that someone's gonna do the right thing when the doors are closed, where it's really not an option. You get presented district lines, and guess what? You just have to approve them. And you don't get to decide which side of the street you represent. I think that's with the assumption that the folks who are in those roles may have the worst intentions in mind, not the best.
So one thing I want to add, kind of building up a couple of points here, Miguel, I think we need to dig a bit deeper into the role or the lack of local media, or at least the dearth of local media and coverage, right? So I think the couch on the end of the street, that's not being picked up, graffiti, absolutely. But to be able to connect the dots between that and what is going on in terms of decisions that are happening in the bureaucracy or political decisions that are happening, and this goes well beyond LA. I mean, at least LA has a couple of newspapers and other entities that, including KCRW, right, and others that are trying to increase public awareness about what is going on in the business of government and how governance works. But in so many other parts of California, right, we've had the decimation of local media. The economic model for local newspapers and other forms of local media have vanished after Craigslist, after the rise of social media. And we don't have anything that's taken its place. So, I'm out in the Inland Empire, east of LA, and we have, charter amendments to the county that get thrown up that have not had much in the way of any kind of public conversation. And that's a big problem. And I think especially if we look outside of the very large cities like Los Angeles, but even in cities like Los Angeles, in terms of neighborhoods, the extent to which voters have a clear sense of what is going on, how representative government works, and what the connections are, and to have that kind of oversight, if you will, right, when elections come up, we just don't have the information to empower residents to be making those decisions.
I think what Karthick brings up is really important for problems with elections and voting, because I've been spending a lot of time, going door to door, talking to voters for campaigns, and the overwhelming message that I hear from people is that voting is, one, it feels very disempowering to people. They don't feel like their vote matters. They don't think it has an impact on government or the outcomes that they're looking for. And two, voting is really hard with these ballots. I mean, there are so many people on these ballots. So and then that's on top of this issue that Karthick is talking about, where there isn't reliable information out there. There's just misinformation. Like, we're seeing that now with all of these elections. As candidates and campaigns attack each other. So people are looking at their ballots. It's an immense research project to understand who's on the ballot, understand issues on the ballot, like of course dialysis. And people are overwhelmed by it. They don't feel like they can make an informed decision. So to me, I'm concerned about trying to address these systemic problems with more voting, when voters don't feel empowered by the process. Where we do have this alternative where we can put people, regular people, and rotate them into panels where they're more able to study these issues like a jury does, and get paid during that process, hear from all sides, and then make a recommendation.
One thing I wanted to say is that the current very confusing structure of LA City, where you have a weaker mayor, 15 stronger council members, where you have a county and a city that are separate, and many small cities within the county, a lot of that decentralization and fragmentation in government came about in response to challenges with East Coast cities and the corruption that people who were out here setting up these governments and thinking about how Los Angeles should run wanted to avoid. They saw a lot of corruption in big East Coast cities. And they said, we don't want a mayor that can be that corrupt. We don't want a city that can be incentivized to be that corrupt. And so what we have here, this kind of proliferation of independent, well, not independent, but kind of empowered people at many, many levels of government, was a fix for a problem that people saw at that time. And the reason why it's so confusing is in part because of the very structures that people stood up to guard against challenges that they were facing when these governments were first created. And so I think one of the things I want to step back and think about is really this question of what are the problems that we're solving as we're looking at this issue? Are we trying to solve a problem of how long it takes to vote? Or are we trying to resolve how governance works in Los Angeles so that we can address some of the broader challenges that we're facing here in this city? And how we do that in ways that really empower the best kind of I think what people really want out of their government. How do we empower residents to get what they need from their government? And I think that's what we have to approach some of these governance reforms with. And I think we can do that. And we can look at what have been the inadvertent harms that have come out of the structure that we set up in response to problems that were there a century ago.
Some people have floated the idea that the reason that people hold on to power is because it is that they're being paid. It's their profession, and maybe we should take that out of the equation. Have you, Karthick, looked at at what happens when being a people's representative is no longer a paid position?
Yeah, I would say be careful what you wish for, right? I mean, it's tough. Often you get reforms that are responding to one problem, but then they end up creating other problems. I mean, you see this in local governments outside of the city of Los Angeles, where they don't pay that much at all, and that means that people need to have a job that enables them to do this work and still maintain some steady level of income. Usually what it means is less time to devote to the kind of oversight and kind of governance questions that you need to do as an elected representative. Often, this is also part of like when you think about places that at the state level that have part-time legislatures, a less kind of professional class of elected politicians, if you will, that you think, great, like those corrupt politicians that are drawing all this money, like let's just do away with all of that. Well, what ends up usually happening is special interests get empowered. Also, career staff get stronger, and it's fine. I mean, there are people who are career staff who do amazing work, but we have representative oversight for a reason. Now, it could be some other, I would still say something like a democratic lottery is a representative system. It's not it is a representative process where you're basically delegating and entrusting that authority to a different kind of institution to do it. But this notion that we can, get rid of the professional politicians, well, you either get like independently wealthy people running things or special interests and those with kind of long-term interests in government, either within government or outside, that gain power.
I think that's a really great point. But one thing I've noticed, talking to voters, is that I actually think people, they don't want to elect professionals or experts to office. Generally they're looking to elect, regular people, like regular working people like them that have the same struggles and experiences. So, I think that that's an interesting aspect of the system that we're using. Because I think there is this desire to have more of that lived experience in decision making. Of course, like still making sure that expertise and facts are part of the process, but ultimately, who's going to be most motivated to, for example, solve a housing problem? It's the people who are struggling the most with housing. They're going to really like feel that urgency and want to move forward solutions.
I do want to push back against that a little bit because I think when I was running for office, at least, one of the reasons people were excited about, volunteering for my campaign was because I came at it from the perspective of an urban planner, and the work that I had done and understanding the policy structure here and I think the capacity for me to be able to say, hey, here is what the city council can do, and here's how it can work better for you, I think was a message that really resonated with people. I think it's really true, though, that we have to find ways to bring people who have lived experience that is really reflective of our broader constituencies into office. And I think thinking about barriers that can prevent people who are renters from being able to run for office, people who are working parents, like that to me is like one of the biggest barriers that I think we face in our system, is that if you're a working parent, the costs of childcare are so much and the time intensiveness of what we expect from parents in our current economic system are so intensive that it's very, very rare that a working parent would ever be able to run for office. And I think having working parents and renters in office who are the really representative of Angelenos, that would be amazing. And I think we should definitely find ways to bring more of those people into office, make it easier for people like that to run, and also make it compensated enough so that they could still take care of their families and do the job of running the city.
We're coming up to the time where we will be taking audience questions soon, but I want to give you guys all a chance to answer just a final question and to kind of lay out your vision of what LA can look like under a true representative democracy. And in your vision, does the LA City Council exist? Miguel, you want to start?
So I think we don't know. I think part of what makes this moment exciting is that it gives us permission to reimagine something that perhaps never has been done before. And I think this is where we really need to rely on those who have spent a career thinking about these issues. I mean, I think expertise will be helpful here, who have written about it, who've thought about it, who've studied other forms of government, and could lay out a pathway that that brings representation closer to regular people, that is accountable, that is transparent, and that is responsive to the real issues that we're facing as a community. So, I think we should give ourselves permission and some grace to kind of really imagine something different, but starting with the shared, conclusion that the status quo isn't working. And I think I didn't hear anyone here advocating for the existing form that we have. So, I think that's what makes this moment kind of exciting and interesting.
Nithya?
Well, I really think about this question from my current position and from my role as one of the 15 people who makes up the LA City Council. And I think when I was running for office, I talked about a lot of governance reforms. I talked about limiting control over land use decisions. I talked about expanding the size of the city council. I talked about, I did talk about independent redistricting. It wasn't a focus, but I've talked about it since I went through redistricting, or redistricting happened to me. But I think one of the things that's really exciting for me at this moment is that these things, which seemed absolutely impossible to get purchase on from the people who are in power right now, who make decisions about how the city is governed, suddenly have an incredible amount of power. There was a LA Times editorial that came out a couple of days ago, which listed a few of these reforms. And the overwhelming majority of people who are currently elected to serve this city are saying, dilute my power, take away the number of constituents I have, reduce the amount of control I have over my district. To me, we're in a really revolutionary moment. And so for me, in my role on this council, I think it is to stay laser focused on what lessons we can learn from what we heard on those tapes, beyond the horrific language that was used and the sentiments expressed. How do we make sure that the kind of politics and politicking that was happening is something that we can turn away from, and how can we build something that's better, that's more representative, that is more just, that leads us to a better and more functional city. Like, we have a moment right now to be able to do that. And my goal is really to say, how do we move as quickly towards that as possible?
So I'll answer this by talking a little bit about, this kind of visioning and kind of strategies is precisely what we're doing with California 100. And I'll just say, not just in LA, so many other communities in California and throughout the country, and even at our state and national level, we are living in disruptive times. And it's very disorienting for folks in terms of what's happening in terms of our media environment, what's happening in terms of government, governance, jobs, future of work, all of that. And moments like that, it's really important to try to ground ourselves in core values. And so what we have in terms of our core values, it's an aspirational futures exercise, and it spells I-RISE, which is innovation, resilience, inclusion, sustainability, and equity. How do we go from these just being slogans to actually operationalizing them? And what does it mean to create systems that improve on all of these? And then finally, we're in the early stages of building a kind of 4-part system of what this kind of vision and roadmap looks like. So the vision part is, what is our ideal California? What is our ideal community for people, for places, and the environment? And then, what are the kinds of solutions that we should take seriously? Let's put everything on the table. And then comes the strategy part. That's the third leg of the stool, if you will, which is, what are the barriers to enacting these solutions, and how do we start picking off these barriers one by one? And then the final part, people can come up with strategy all day. What is our commitment? So what are we individually, personally, professionally, institutionally going to do to make sure that we reach that summit, that vision, right? That better Los Angeles, that better California. So in some ways, I'm not going to give my vision itself, because this is what we're trying to do, is to try to create a movement where more and more people are part of the conversation, and expertise matters. So it's not just any opinion is fine. It's like, let's have a common set of at least some facts, and thinking about tensions and trade-offs between different types of solutions. But really, we have to open it up, because we are living, in terms of our politics, in terms of our economics and society and global forces, climate change, we haven't talked about that. Like, there are all sorts of things that the kind of status quo is definitely not going to suit us well in the next decade, let alone the next century. And we got to get started as soon as possible.
Leonora, you get the last word.
So maybe we'll continue to have a city council, maybe not. I think a lot of the reform ideas that have been discussed are very exciting, but I hope that we make sure there are more opportunities for Angelenos to directly serve in some of these government decision-making roles, like some of these other examples like Paris and Belgium. We could have permanent parts of government that are a cross-section of the community. We have a civil grand jury in LA County, which is also a democratic lottery. And I think all the time, what if we gave their recommendations more weight in the government? I think that would be a really exciting next step, because they do make really great recommendations. And when we have these new opportunities, to really get outside of the status quo and make sure that we're listening to voices that are not a part of the current power structure, like when we're possibly going to do a charter reform commission, that's where I think the opportunity is greatest, and it's most important to get Angelenos directly involved with that. And so, I hope that we pay more attention to these opportunities and revive this democratic tradition more, and really empower Angelenos that way.
Great. Does anyone in the audience have questions? You can line up on the side of the room. Any questions?
In the meantime, we could start with an online question,
Okay.
which of course disappeared from my phone as soon as I... Okay. In the immediate term, What should we demand of leaders, and what should we demand they demand of their colleagues?
Who wants to take that one? Miguel?
I think in the immediate term, as the city is exploring these questions, the public should demand that the process itself have an element that's independent. That really, it's at the fundamental point of the spear is taking power away from those who are in power. And it's very seductive when you are in power, as we heard in that room. So I think that this process has to have a real element of that. Not only experts, but folks on the ground where there are real consequences for what that power does and doesn't do. And so it's incumbent on all of us as Angelenos to engage in that, and not just wait until the council says this is a proposal and we're going to move it forward, but really allow for the input to come in, even if unsolicited sometimes.
The last 3 mayors have either not had a second term or had a disastrous second term. And the narrative of this campaign is if we elect one or the other of these candidates, somehow things will be better because they have the answers, just as the past 3 mayors have hoped to surmount the inadequacies of the system. The dominant narrative continues to be if we could just elect the right mayor, all this would be fixed, and both candidates have pandered to that assumption. My question for the panelists, because I think you've surfaced fantastic ideas, is how do we get beyond 100 people on Zócalo to make this a dominant narrative, and we don't lose this moment, and we actually begin to talk about systemic reform in a serious way that doesn't peter out or get sidetracked to a council committee, or like the calls for Kevin De Leon just kind of to resign, just kind of peter out. How do we keep the conversation focused on systemic reform?
Who wants to take
Well,
this
maybe
one?
I'll jump on something you said, Councilmember, at the beginning of this constant irritant and pain, but maybe that's the spur, right? For every month, like that is a sign of a failure, a system that is in some type of failure. And that, I think, potentially then could just be that kind of constant goad to say that we need to maybe not rethink everything, but rethink a lot of things. Because this is a symptom, and there are other symptoms that pop up, from homelessness and from the way that, construction decisions get made, et cetera, and to really be that kind of goad. Right, because otherwise it's the kind of thing which a lot of people, I think, will just want to move on to say, oh, this is not us, this doesn't reflect us, and let's just move on. And I think that's, new mayor comes in, and that's going to be the temptation. But in the vein of like, let's not have a crisis go to waste, but let's not have this kind of a thing. Like it should be a mirror, and it should be a mirror that we look at as often as possible to figure out how can we do better.
I think there's a real danger if we use this moment and continue to do more of what's led to this problem in the first place. And one way that could happen is if changes are made, but we're still relying on elections and processes that put the same people who already have access to power back into decision-making positions. It's no surprise that we'll continue to see these kinds of crises happen again and again. But if we want to have new perspectives and we want to kind of get outside of that power structure that's already existing, then that's where we really need to go directly to the people of Los Angeles and hear from diverse viewpoints and people who maybe don't have the means or the opportunity to make this kind of to dedicate their lives to getting that kind of power. Like they still have really important perspectives and insights to offer us in this moment. And I worry that if we don't center those perspectives at this time, then we're going to just get back into the same old rhythms.
Anyone else? How we can keep from doing the same thing over and over?
Oh. Well, I think, I do feel like we do have a moment here that is very powerful. And I also just do want to point to the fact that we have had changes that happened in the city recently that have impacted the composition of the city council now. So 2 things happened, which I think were really transformative. One was that the election year changed from being on an off-year cycle to being on a federal election cycle, right? So my election happened when the presidential election was happening, and now our elections are timed with the midterms. So voter turnout is naturally higher. And what we've seen in the last election cycles, and we'll see what happens next week, but already in the primary and in my election and in the primary of this election, we've seen that new candidates are coming into power who would not traditionally have been elected here in Los Angeles because new voters came to the polls and elected new people. The second thing that was really transformative was matching funds. So that was campaign finance reform. And so for every dollar that somebody in the city of Los Angeles donates to a candidate who's running for office, the city matches it 1 to 6. So you get 6 times the number of city dollars for every dollar that's donated from a resident of LA. And that was transformative. I mean, I got something like $185,000 from the city of LA for my general election campaign, which meant that I could play ball against an incumbent who raised the most amount of money in city council history for his campaign, right? And that was absolutely transformative. Me, a total political newbie, was elected. And that's cool, right? And that came about because of reforms. And I think we can think about reforms like these that are going to have really transformative impacts. And I think, I'm here because I'm an optimist. And I'm an optimist and a very practical person. And so I feel like here's what I can do, here's my sphere of influence, and I'm really, really going to push on the things that I think are going to have those kinds of transformative changes going forward, because we've already seen them have some pretty big changes on LA City Council already.
Okay, this is the last question we're going to have time for, but please join us at the reception following the event to continue the conversation.
Hello, my name is Edward Martinez. I worked for the government for 27 years as a military person. I was in Iraq twice, a Purple Heart recipient. I was wondering why De Leon and Cadillo are being accused of something that they did not say. According to that billboard, they were silent through that meeting. They were showing respect for Martinez. And they knew that to be low profile is an asset in any government job. My question is to the lady with the red pantsuit. Leonora.
Me?
Do you think
I don't know.
Do you think it's possible, any possibility that De Leon and Cedillo may be innocent?
Is your question for Councilmember Raman or for
Leonora?
I think
No.
Nithya.
Oh.
Nithya.
The council member, the lady.
Well, I think we heard some pretty horrific comments from everyone who was at that table that day or wherever they were in the conference room. We heard comments from council members that were anti-Oaxacan, anti-indigenous, that were spoken by all of the council members. We heard a comparison from one of the 2 council members mentioned here, comparing a young black boy to an accessory, to a Louis Vuitton purse, something that's both racist and homophobic. It's a homophobic trope to have a child as an accessory. There were horrific statements that were stated by every single person in that room. And I think as an elected official, I think I'm a human, we are all humans, we all err, we all make mistakes. And I think as an elected official, one of the things that we also have to do is step up and to speak up when there's wrongs that are happening around you. So I think in addition to comments that were made by those individuals, I think they do have a responsibility to speak truth, even to someone who's very powerful in that room, and to say, hey, this is crossing a line. You don't, even to demur, even to say, you can't really believe that, that's not funny, I feel uncomfortable with this. There's so many ways in which an intervention could have been made that would have made that conversation look and feel very, very different from what we heard and what we saw. So it's not, I think, for me, in many ways, to forgive those individuals because the comments were not directed at me. Mike Bonin, my colleague on the council, said it's not even for him to forgive, it's for his son Jacob to choose when forgiveness happens and to grant them that forgiveness. But I think in the meantime, we do have to make sure that we are all standing up, as they didn't in that room, to say, this is not right and this doesn't represent us, and this is unacceptable for Los Angeles.
Well, we have to end it there. We could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for joining us online. There's a reception in the back for people who are here in person. This will be online on the Zócalo website tomorrow. And thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Don't forget to subscribe to the Zócalo newsletter and the podcast and to the Zócalo social media feeds. And thank you guys all for coming. And thanks for my panel.